The teacher laughed when Elijah answered, not because it was wrong, but because it came from him. 7 days later, that same teacher would be holding a test score so high it would silence the entire room. A whole room of kids smirking behind hands and chuckling behind desks. Not because the joke was funny, but because it came from the teacher. And the punchline? A quiet black kid with a hoodie and a brain full of stars. His answer wasn't wrong, it was just unexpected. Unexpected from him.
But they didn't know what he knew.
And they definitely didn't know what was coming next.
Because 7 days after they laughed at Elijah Carter,
they'd be reading his name at the top of a statewide leaderboard. And suddenly the boy who didn't belong was the one rewriting the rules. Elijah Carter was 14 the first time someone laughed at him for being right. It was a Tuesday morning, 3rd period, Honours Science with Mr. Daly, a class Elijah had tested into early. The kind of class where everyone already knew each other from summer programs and after-school clubs, everyone except Elijah. He didn't raise his hand much, he didn't talk unless called on. Mostly, he listened. Wrote everything down. Eyes half hidden under his hoodie, always thinking, always watching. His notebook was messy in the most beautiful way, crammed with formulas and scribbles and margin notes that made sense only to him. But they made sense. Mr. Daly never saw that, though. To him, Elijah was the scholarship kid with the slouchy backpack and too much silence. He called on him when no one else answered, like a quiz he didn't expect to pass. That day, the topic was astrophysics, just an intro lesson, nothing crazy. Mr. Daly wrote escape velocity on the board, then turned to the class. Let's say you're on the moon. What would it take to launch a spacecraft from the surface into space? The room went quiet. A few hands raised. Most looked confused. Then surprisingly, Elijah raised his hand. Mr. Daly raised his eyebrows. Elijah? Elijah's voice was calm. You'd need less thrust than on Earth, about 1/5 of what a rocket needs here, because the moon's gravitational pull is weaker and there's no atmosphere to push against. The room went still.
It was a good answer, a great answer.
But Mr. Daly let out a short laugh, the kind adults use when they think a kid's trying to sound smart. He shook his head slightly. Well, that's creative, he said, eyes skimming the class for amusement. Maybe next time stick to the basics, Elijah. A few kids chuckled. One boy whispered something behind him. Elijah didn't respond, didn't blink. He just looked down at his notebook and quietly flipped to a new page. Mr. Daly kept teaching, the class kept moving, but something shifted in the air, like the whole room had silently agreed on something Elijah couldn't quite hear, but could feel. At lunch, no one sat with him. Not because they hated him, but because in middle school, distance is the safest response to discomfort. And Elijah made people uncomfortable, not because he was loud or angry or mean, but because he didn't perform. He didn't shrink, but he didn't shout either. He just was, and that was enough to unsettle people. After school, Elijah walked home alone, like always, past the cracked sidewalks and corner stores of his neighborhood, past the basketball court where his older brother Marcus used to run the game, before school stopped being part of the plan. At home, his mom was on shift at the hospital. She'd left a note. Dinner in the fridge. Love you, baby. She always called him baby, even though he hadn't felt like one in years. He ate in silence, then opened his notebook and rewrote the entire lesson from memory, correcting where Mr. Daly had oversimplified, adding diagrams from the library book he'd borrowed last week. Elijah didn't study for grades. He studied because the universe made sense, and he needed something to make sense.
Because the world didn't.
Not when you got laughed at for being right. At school, the laughter didn't linger. Not for them. But it did for him. It echoed in the way eyes slid past him. In the way Mr. Daly avoided calling on him after that. In the way kids started saying things like, "Don't get too deep, Carter. You might confuse the teacher." He didn't respond, never fought back. But every night the notebook got fuller. And the week after the incident, as quietly as he entered the room each day, Elijah sat down for the statewide STEM aptitude test. He finished in just under an hour. Most students were still on page 2. Mr. Daly raised an eyebrow as Elijah turned it in. "You sure you're done?" Elijah nodded once. "Yes, sir." Then he walked back to his desk, sat down, and opened his notebook to a blank page. He started sketching stars. But the test he just took? That was the spark.
And 7 days later,
That spark was about to set the whole room on fire. After that day, Mr. Daly didn't call on Elijah much anymore. Not out of spite, but the way some people ignore what they don't understand. It's easier to skip past the quiet ones. Easier to pretend a moment of discomfort didn't happen. But Elijah didn't forget. And neither did the notebook. It grew heavier that week. Each page more crowded than the last. Pages filled late at night, while the city hummed outside his window and his mom worked the overnight shift in the ER. On Thursday, Elijah built a gravity simulator using paper clips, string, and a cut-up soda bottle. On Friday, he rewrote an article from Scientific American into simpler language, then translated it again into Spanish, just to see if he could.
it wasn't for school.
It wasn't for anyone. It was just for him. At school, nothing changed on the surface. Kids still passed him in the hallway like he wasn't there. Mr. Daly still gave him the safe assignments, the ones that required memorization, not insight. But under all that silence, something was building. The following week, the school announced statewide testing for all advanced STEM students. It wasn't just about grades. It was part of a pilot program. The state wanted to identify exceptional emerging talent. Top scorers would be considered for a summer program hosted by a major university. Fully funded, national attention. A pipeline to opportunity. The kind of thing that could change a life. Mr. Daly handed out the test packets with his usual clipboard in hand, walking desk to desk. "This is timed," he said. 2 hours, no phones, no talking. This isn't about speed, it's about depth." When he got to Elijah's desk, he hesitated just a beat. Then he dropped the packet, didn't say a word, just walked on. Elijah read the first page, then the second, then the third. It wasn't hard, it was layered. The kind of questions that didn't want memorization, they wanted thought. By the 50-minute mark, Elijah was done. He rechecked his answers. Once, then twice, then once more, backward.
He stood up and walked his packet to the front. Mr. Daly didn't look up.
"You sure you're done?" he muttered, barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir." Back at his desk, he opened his notebook and started writing equations. Not from the test, but something else. Something he'd been working on at home. The room was still full of scratching pencils, shifting feet, low murmurs. But Elijah's page was quiet. He wasn't rushing. He was ready. That night, Principal Hernandez received an alert in her email. Preliminary test scans were beginning to populate the statewide system. It would take a few days for official rankings, but early scores were coming in. She skimmed through the list of schools, scrolling for hers. Then she stopped, squinted, scrolled back up.
One student had scored in the 99.9% percentile. Not just in their school, not just in their district, but statewide.
And not just a perfect score. A score above perfect, earned through bonus tier reasoning questions that were rarely even attempted. One name, one result. Carter, Elijah. 104.3%. She stared at the screen, then read it again. The next morning, Mr. Daly walked into the staff lounge to find Principal Hernandez waiting. She was holding a printout, test score sheets, no smile, no small talk, just a single question. "Can you explain why the top STEM score in the state came from your class and you never mentioned the student once?" Mr. Daly blinked. I'm not sure. Who was it?" She handed him the paper. His eyes scanned down the list and stopped cold. The name hit like a wave. "Elijah," he said, barely audible. "He finished early." Principal Hernandez's voice was calm.
and he still scored higher than anyone we've ever seen.
Then she turned and walked away. By lunch, the entire administration knew. By third period, so did the class. But Elijah didn't, not yet. He sat in his usual seat. Third row, second desk from the left. Hoodie up, pencil tapping, notebook open, still drawing, still building. Third period began the same way it always did. Dry markers on the whiteboard, a loosely followed lecture about orbital motion, and students half listening as Mr. Daly walked through diagrams he'd drawn 100 times before. Elijah sat in his usual spot near the window, hoodie pulled low, notebook open, eyes sharp and quiet. He wasn't thinking about the lesson. He was already 3 chapters ahead. What happened a week ago was long behind him. But what the world didn't know was that it had never left him. He just carried it differently. Halfway through the lesson, the door creaked open. All heads turned. Principal Hernandez stood in the doorway, poised and unsmiling, holding a single folded paper in her hand. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She stepped inside like someone who had something to say, and wasn't going to ask permission to say it. Mr. Daly straightened up at the front of the class, confused but polite. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, caught somewhere between discomfort and curiosity. She didn't answer him right away. Her eyes moved to Elijah, then back to the students. Her voice was even, clear and calm. "Sorry to interrupt," she began, "but this won't take long, and I think it needs to be heard." That got everyone's attention. Even Mr. Daly froze, dry erase marker still in hand. The principal unfolded the paper and held it with both hands like it carried weight. "Last week, this class participated in the statewide STEM aptitude exam," she continued. "It's not just a test, it's a tool designed to measure depth of understanding, advanced reasoning, and applied logic. In short, it identifies brilliance where it lives." A few students shifted in their seats. One girl rolled her pen slowly between her fingers. Another boy whispered, "It's probably Olivia." Mr. Daly cleared his throat quietly, already anticipating the name. But Principal Hernandez wasn't finished. "This year," she said, "the highest recorded score in the entire state, not just in this school or this district, but in the state, came from this very room." The room went still. The whispers stopped. Everyone looked around. "Not only that," she said, voice rising just a little, "but the student didn't just ace the test. He completed every core section, every bonus question, and earned a final score of 104.3%, a score higher than any ever recorded since the state adopted this metric." Now the room wasn't just quiet, it was breathless. Then she said the name. Elijah Carter. For a second, no one reacted. It was like the name didn't compute. Then slowly, heads turned. The kid in the hoodie. The one everyone ignored. The one who answered that question and got laughed at. The one who had sat through every insult, every dismissal, and never once raised his voice. Elijah didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile or lift his head. He just looked at the page in front of him, calmly turned it, and kept writing. Mr. Daly looked like the floor had dropped beneath him. I had no idea," he stammered. "I didn't know." Principal Hernandez cut him off with a look, sharp and swift. "You didn't ask," she said, flatly. Her eyes didn't linger on him long. She turned back to Elijah. "You're being nominated for the state's elite STEM summer program," she said. "It's full scholarship. Ivy League scouts are already monitoring this cohort. Expect a call this week."
Only then did Elijah raise his eyes. Not all the way. Just enough to meet hers and nod. "Thank you," he said softly. Then he went back to his notebook. That was it.
No celebration, no performance, no "I told you so." Just quiet dignity and the weight of self-knowledge. The rest of the class sat in stunned silence. Some students stared at him like they were trying to reprocess every moment they'd shared, every time they'd laughed or looked past him. The same kids who once dismissed him now sat 3 feet away from a name that would probably appear in national headlines before the year was out. Mr. Daly looked like he wanted to shrink into the floor. Class resumed, but it didn't really. The words kept coming from the front of the room, but no one was listening the same way anymore. Something had shifted. Something had broken. And in the center of it sat Elijah, unchanged, unbothered, unmoved, still writing quietly, still learning, still rising. The bell rang at the end of class, but no one rushed to leave. Students gathered their things more slowly than usual, sneaking glances at Elijah as if seeing him for the first time. Some looked curious, some looked guilty. Mr. Daly lingered near his desk, pretending to straighten papers, but really just avoiding the moment he knew he owed. Elijah moved the same way he always did, quietly, methodically, sliding his notebook into his backpack, zipping it shut, and slinging it over one shoulder. As he stepped into the hallway, the whispers followed. This time not laughter, not mockery, just the soft, stunned realization that something extraordinary had been sitting quietly among them all along. After school, Elijah was called into Principal Hernandez's office. Not for discipline, not for warning, for something else entirely. She sat behind her desk, the setting sun casting long stripes of gold across the carpet, and gestured for him to sit. When he did, she smiled. Not the polite kind, but the kind you give someone you genuinely respect. "You know," she said, folding her hands together, "some people speak loud to be heard. They shout, they demand attention, they need the world to notice them." She paused, looking at him with something close to pride. But the ones who truly know who they are, they don't have to shout. They move through the world quietly, and the world eventually has no choice but to turn and listen. Elijah said nothing, but the weight of her words landed in the part of him that had been carrying silence like armor for years. Walking home, the city looked different, but Elijah didn't. The cracked sidewalks, the leaning fences, the empty basketball court where Marcus once ruled, it was all the same. But inside, something had shifted, not because of the score, not because of the whispers, but because he had proven something to himself long before anyone else caught up. He had always been enough. The rest of the world was just late to realize it. At home, he found another note from his mom. "Proud of you, always." Dinner was in the fridge, as promised. He ate quickly, then opened his notebook. This time, there were no science problems waiting for him. No formulas, no diagrams, just a blank page and a pen. He wrote 3 words at the top, in neat, steady handwriting. "Let them laugh." It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Let them laugh, let them doubt, let them underestimate. It didn't matter. Their assumptions were not his chains, they were his fuel. The next morning at school, Mr. Daly tried to make amends, a clumsy comment about how some students surprise us in wonderful ways. Elijah nodded respectfully but didn't engage. He wasn't interested in apologies wrapped in excuses. He wasn't interested in being anyone's lesson plan for humility. He just wanted to learn, to grow, to keep building the quiet empire inside his mind that no one could take away. Over the next few weeks, things changed, slowly, subtly. A few classmates started asking him for help on projects. Some teachers who had once overlooked him now paid closer attention. Not because Elijah demanded it, not because he changed who he was, but because truth, real, undeniable excellence, commands its own respect. One afternoon, as he walked home, Elijah thought about all the times he had been overlooked, laughed at, doubted. He realized he didn't need to erase those moments. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone but himself. The real victory wasn't the score or the scholarship or the headlines that would eventually follow. It was the quiet certainty burning steady in his chest that he was built for more. And no one, no teacher, no whisper, no laugh, could take that from him. In the end, Elijah Carter didn't just pass the test. He became the test, a quiet standard against which the smallness of other people's expectations would always be measured. And from that day forward, whenever anyone underestimated him, he didn't correct them. He didn't argue. He simply smiled to himself and kept moving forward, knowing that sooner or later the world would have to catch up. Because brilliance doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it just waits. Patient, steady, inevitable, until the light is too bright to ignore.